Imagine looking at an English dictionary, a completely standard everyday tool, and realizing it was the specific instrument blinding you to the truth of ancient history.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Right. You think you're gaining clarity, but the words on the page are actually acting as a filter. They are distorting a reality that existed millennia before modern English was ever spoken.
That is a terrifying thought, honestly.
It really is. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are tearing down the illusion that your English Bible perfectly mirrors ancient reality.
Absolutely.
Our goal for today's deep dive is highly specific. We are going to strip away the invisible cultural blinders that alter how Western readers understand the biblical text.
Right, because those blinders are massive.
They are. And we're pulling from two specific sources today. The first is a book titled Just Words and the Word Made Flesh, and the second is an article called Unseen Icebergs.
Both fantastic sources.
Yes, and both of these texts argue that the modern reader brings a massive, crushing weight of cultural baggage to the page, baggage that completely alters the original meaning of the text.
I mean, we do it without even realizing it.
So my question to you, the listener, is this. How often do you assume that an English translation completely captures an ancient reality? The sources use this brilliant analogy of an iceberg.
I love that analogy.
What you see on the page, the English vocabulary, is just the tip of the iceberg visible above the water. But hiding below the surface, completely unseen, is a massive accumulation of cultural assumptions, philosophical biases, and modern habits of mind.
Yeah, that invisible gap is the core problem identified in both of these texts. The hidden gap between the modern Western mind and the ancient text is vast, and it is incredibly dangerous to ignore.
For sure.
I mean, the Bible is not a post-industrial revolution, democratic Western book wearing ancient clothes. It was written in a completely different world.
We tend to forget that.
We do. When we talk about language, we have to understand that language is not just a collection of vocabulary words waiting to be swapped out in a one-to-one exchange. Language is an all-encompassing worldview.
It carries everything with it.
Precisely. It carries hidden assumptions about how relationships function, what is considered honorable or shameful, how authority is structured, and how the physical and spiritual realms interact.
Right. And the Western mind has been totally reshaped by the Enlightenment.
Yes, we prize scientific rationalism, we prize concrete data, and above all, we prize the autonomous individual.
Yeah, the self-made man concept.
Exactly. I mean, absolutely. But the authors of these ancient texts lived in a world driven by collectivism, covenantal solidarity, and integrated spiritual reality.
Which is a huge clash.
A severe clash. When you read a text written by someone whose entire society is structured around communal identity, and you process that text through a brain trained to idolize personal privacy and self-actualization, a severe distortion occurs.
So you end up bending the ancient text to fit the shape of your modern mind.
Yes, rather than letting the ancient text reshape your mind. This is the danger of the unseen iceberg.
Well, I think we need to look at the illusion of linguistic equivalence and the massive deficit of the English language.
Let's do it.
Because it is this arrogant assumption of the Western world that our language has an accurate match for ancient concepts. I want to pose a specific analogy to you, the listener, to illustrate this deficit, because it has to do with what a culture values.
Okay. Lay it out.
Think about the automotive industry. In the English language, we have dozens, perhaps hundreds, of highly specialized words for car parts.
Oh, right.
If a mechanic pointed to a fuel injector and called it an alternator, another mechanic would laugh them out of the garage.
They absolutely would.
We have words like catalytic converter, planetary gear set, and torque converter. We have this massive, precise vocabulary because our culture heavily values the automotive industry and the freedom of individual travel.
Right. Our language evolved to reflect what we prioritize.
Precisely. But when it comes to supreme virtues, when it comes to the highest moral and spiritual realities of the ancient world, our language is drastically impoverished.
It really is lacking.
We try to take massive, multifaceted, ancient concepts and cram them into tiny, inadequate English boxes. We look at an ancient text, see a word translated as love, and we assume our English word perfectly matches the ancient reality, which is a massive failure of understanding.
It is a massive failure because we are collapsing distinct vital concepts into a single overloaded term.
Right.
The sources detail how the Greek language had highly specific, distinct words for different facets of love. Now, many people might be familiar with the basic definitions.
Like agape and philia.
Yes, agape as unconditional devotion, philia as brotherly affection, eros as romantic passion, and storge as familial bond. But what the author is highlighting is how the English flattening of these words fundamentally alters Western church culture.
How?
Well, when the ancient mind heard agape, they understood a resolute decision to seek the highest good of another, regardless of the cost. It was an action, not primarily an emotion.
Ah, I see.
But because the English language uses the same word to describe our devotion to the creator of the universe and, like, our preference for a specific type of pizza, we subconsciously import the emotional, preferential nature of English love into the biblical command.
Wow. Yeah, that makes total sense.
We start thinking that loving God or loving our neighbor requires a specific emotional frequency rather than a decisive sacrificial action.
I want to look at the Hebrew concept of cheesed, because the linguistic gap there seems even wider.
Oh, cheesed is a fascinating one.
The text unpacks cheesed as the relentless, active, covenantal loving-kindness and loyalty of Yahweh. Often you hear people use overly dramatic metaphors for this, like trying to pour the ocean into a teacup.
Right, you hear that a lot.
But based on what the author is actually describing, that metaphor feels wrong.
Yeah.
If cheesed is a binding structural loyalty to a covenant partner, it is less like an ocean and more like trying to describe a complex, binding legal trust and a massive architectural foundation using the word nice.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
It implies action, rescue, and steadfastness in the face of rebellion. It is a robust, muscular grace. The English language simply lacks a word that carries the combined weight of mercy, loyalty, covenantal obligation, and structural steadfastness.
That is a much more accurate way to look at it. Cheesed operates within a covenantal framework, which is a structural reality, not a sentimental feeling of goodwill.
It is not just being friendly.
Not at all. When we read loving kindness in English, we think of a gentle disposition. But cheesed is the structural integrity of God's promise. It is the reality that he will act to save his people because he is legally and morally bound by his own character and his own oath to do so.
That carries so much more weight.
It does. And another crucial example provided by the sources regarding this linguistic deficit is the Greek concept of makarios.
Oh yeah, the Beatitudes word.
Spot on. In our English Bibles, this is most often translated as blessed or happy, but the source defines makarios far more comprehensively.
How do they define it?
It is a state of holistic contentment and the favored status of a soul that is rightly aligned with God. It is a state of being that remains completely untouched by the chaotic circumstances of a fallen world.
So it has nothing to do with external events.
Right. It is not a temporary emotion dependent on good circumstances. It is an objective status of favor and a resulting internal fortitude.
The author takes a really sharp swing at the prosperity gospel regarding this specific word.
Yes, they do.
The text argues that the prosperity gospel takes this magnificent concept of makarios and drags it down into material wealth and carnal success.
Which is a severe distortion of the text.
According to the author, this movement perverts the original language by turning a spiritual reality into a guarantee of financial prosperity, physical health, and easy living.
And the text makes a compelling case for how that happens.
The author asserts that this massive theological shift is made possible because our English vocabulary lacks the precision to protect the true definition of the word.
It leaves a gap.
Right. We are simply relaying the author's critique here, but it is fascinating to see how the author connects a linguistic deficit, lacking a precise word for objective spiritual favor, to a massive shift in modern religious practice. Lacking the proper vocabulary is clearly a massive issue.
It creates a vacuum, and human nature will always fill that vacuum with whatever the surrounding culture values most.
That makes total sense.
In the West, we value material wealth and emotional happiness, so we fill the vacuum left by the word blessed with money and good feelings. We lose the ancient reality entirely.
So if a lack of vocabulary creates a vacuum, what happens when we go a step further? Lacking vocabulary is one issue, but forcing the completely wrong vocabulary onto a text has literally altered world history.
Oh, absolutely.
So if a single mistranslated word can build an empire, it forces us to look at the historical catastrophes of translation.
The historical case study provided by the text regarding translation errors is absolutely staggering.
It really highlights the stakes here.
It shows how getting the grammar and the translation wrong does not just cause a minor misunderstanding in a Sunday school class. It rewrites the theology of entire continents.
Wow.
The source points us to the Latin Vulgate error. In the original Greek of the New Testament, you have the word metanoeo.
Okay.
This word describes a radical internal change of mind and heart that leads to repentance. It is an internal turning away from sin and a turning toward God. It is a posture of the soul.
An internal reality.
Yes. However, when the medieval Roman Catholic Church translated this Greek word into Latin, they used the phrase poenitentiamum agit.
And what does that mean?
This Latin phrase translates to do penance. You can immediately see the catastrophic shift.
Oh, wow.
The Greek word demands an internal change of heart. The Latin translation commands an external, measurable action. It moves the concept from the hidden realm of the heart to the visible realm of physical performance.
I want to pause on the historical implications of that. The text builds a massive historical argument detailing the fallout from this single linguistic error.
The fallout was monumental.
The author argues that this specific translation error changing repent to do penance birthed the entire treasury of merit, the sale of indulgences, and a massive system of works righteousness.
All from one phrase.
When you think about the psychological weight on a medieval peasant, it is terrifying. They were told by the text that they must do penance to be right with God. Because penance is a physical action, an entire ecclesiastical structure was built to facilitate and measure that action.
You had to prove it.
Right, you had to go on pilgrimages, you had to perform specific deeds, you had to buy indulgence letters to offset the penance you could not complete. The text makes the historical case that millions of people lived under a heavy burden of performing external rites because a single Greek word was pushed into the wrong Latin phrase.
That is the central thesis of the author's historical argument. The ecclesiastical architecture of the Middle Ages, the confessionals, the intricate formulas for how much time in purgatory was remitted by specific actions, was all built on the foundation of penitentiam agit.
It is wild to think about.
It created a system where grace was mediated through the performance of tasks. And because the common person could not read Greek, they had no way to challenge the system. They were trapped in a theological framework dictated by a flawed translation.
The historical fallout is massive, and the correction to that error is equally massive. The text highlights Martin Luther and his insistence on returning to the original Greek text.
A crucial turning point.
When Luther, reading Erasmus's Greek New Testament, realized that the original word was metaneo and not poenitentiam agit, it shattered the entire system he had been living under.
It changed everything for him.
By recovering the original Greek definition, the text argues that Luther was able to rescue the doctrine of justification by faith alone. He realized that God was demanding a broken and contrite heart, not the purchase of an indulgence or the completion of a physical pilgrimage.
Exactly.
Returning to the original language acted as a sledgehammer to that entire medieval worldview and changed the trajectory of Western civilization.
It was a linguistic revelation that sparked a theological revolution. When Luther understood that the command was to change one's mind and trust in the finished work of Christ, rather than to perform acts of penance to satisfy God's justice, the entire treasury of merit collapsed.
The burden was gone.
The burden of physical performance was lifted by recovering the accurate vocabulary.
This makes me want to ask a specific question, thinking about the listener. If an ancient software glitch like poenitentiam agit could crash a theological operating system for centuries, forcing millions of people into a system of works righteousness, what invisible assumptions are we making right now?
That is the million-dollar question.
We look at the Latin Vulgate error and think how obvious it is, but what are our modern English habits building? When a modern Westerner reads the text today, what unseen cultural grammar is hijacking the meaning?
To answer that, we have to look at the Western lens of individualism and how fiercely it clashes with ancient collectivist texts.
Okay, let's unpack that.
We are applying post-Enlightenment, democratic, and secular humanist frameworks to ancient documents, and the distortion is severe. We assume that the individuals in the text think and act like modern Americans or Europeans.
Which they definitely do not.
The text provides a brilliant example of this by dissecting the privacy myth, specifically looking at Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Oh, this part of the source was eye-opening.
Westerners idolize personal space. We value alone time as a basic human right. We have an entire psychological vocabulary dedicated to self-care, boundaries, and taking time for oneself.
Right, mental health days.
So, when a Western reader looks at the text and sees Jesus separating himself from the disciples in the garden, we instinctively project our cultural values onto him. We assume he was seeking some private time, perhaps taking a mental health break from the stress of the crowd and the impending trial.
We read our need for a quiet weekend into his darkest hour. But the text explains that the East views isolation very differently, right?
Completely differently. In the ancient Near East, isolation was viewed with intense suspicion or seen as a severe punishment.
Really?
Yes, to be cut off from your community was a fate worse than death. The society was communal. Your identity was wrapped up in your family, your tribe, and your people. To seek isolation was seen as bizarre or shameful.
Seeking alone time was just not a thing.
Not at all. The grammar and the historical context show that Jesus did not separate himself for a private break. He separated himself for agonizing mediatorial prayer.
Wow.
The text is not showing us a man seeking privacy. It is showing us the terrifying weight of the sins of the world coming down upon the mediator, forcing him into an agonizing separation from his followers.
That completely changes the tone of the scene.
He was stepping into the role of the solitary high priest on the Day of Atonement. When we read privacy into the text, we shrink a cosmic redemptive event into a modern therapeutic category. We miss the horror of his isolation because we view isolation as a luxury.
That shrinking effect also happens with our sentence structures, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely.
The English language has an absolute obsession with active verbs and direct subjects. We always want to know who is doing the action and what the immediate result is. We are wired for cause and effect, for production and reward.
Very true.
I want to point out the grammar of the Beatitudes as an example of this clash. The text notes that when an English reader sees, "Blessed are the peacemakers," our minds frantically search for the active agent.
Right, we want to know who is doing the blessing.
We subconsciously adjust the phrase to read, "God blesses the peacemakers." We turn it into a transaction. If you perform the action of making peace, then God will reward you with a blessing. We force our transactional grammar onto the text.
And that grammatical forcing completely alters the meaning. The Greek structure of the Beatitudes is not a transaction. It is a declaration of an existing reality.
A declaration.
Yes, it is an objective statement of fact about the citizens of the kingdom. Jesus is declaring that the peacemakers are currently in a state of makarios, a state of holistic favored status, regardless of their external circumstances.
So it is not conditional.
It is not saying, do this to get that. It is declaring this is the reality of who you are. When we force our active transactional grammar onto a declarative Greek structure, we turn grace into a wage to be earned. We make it about our performance rather than God's declaration.
So we take a declarative statement of grace and turn it into a conditional contract because our grammar demands a transaction. That is an incredible insight.
It really challenges how we read everyday passages.
And speaking of transactions, this leads into another massive cultural clash detailed in the sources. The patronage system.
Yes, this is a big one.
The text spends a significant amount of time unpacking the Roman cultural system of patronage to explain the words charis, which is translated as grace, and pistis, which is translated as faith. Before we get into the theology, can you describe the sociology of the Roman street? How did this system actually work in everyday life?
The Roman patronage system was the fundamental glue of society. It was not a religious concept. It was a secular, economic, and social reality. There was no middle class, no social safety net, and no democratic equality. Society was strictly divided between the powerful and the powerless.
Right.
Here's how the text explains the mechanics. A wealthy, powerful patron, someone with resources, land, or political influence, would give a lavish, unmerited gift to a client who is in a desperate crisis.
Like what kind of crisis?
Perhaps the client was facing debtor's prison or starvation. This unmerited gift, which solved a problem the client could never solve on their own, was called charis.
Wait, I'm struggling with the patronage concept here.
Sure. What is the sticking point?
If it is a completely free gift, an unmerited favor to solve a crisis, why is the client bound to lifelong loyalty? Doesn't that just make it a transactional debt?
I see where you're going.
If I have to spend the rest of my life showing public loyalty to this patron, it feels like I am just paying off a loan with my social capital rather than my money. How is that different from a standard debt in our modern framework?
That is the exact tension the Western mind feels, but it is a misunderstanding of honor and shame cultures. In a transactional culture, you pay a debt and the relationship ends. The goal is to return to a state of independence.
Right, you want to be free and clear.
But in the Roman world, independence was a myth. The gift of charis was so massive that it could never be paid back. To even attempt to pay it back would be considered a grave insult to the patron's honor, as it would imply the patron was a merchant making a trade.
Oh, wow. I did not realize that.
Instead, the proper, honorable response to receiving charis was to enter into a permanent relationship of submission. The client's response was lifelong public gratitude, advancing the patron's honor in the city, and resolute loyalty.
So it was about honor, not repayment.
This lifelong loyalty and public trust was called pistis. It was not a repayment. It was the required posture of a grateful recipient.
So the goal was not to clear the ledger. The goal was to remain in the relationship, constantly pointing to the patron's generosity.
Correct. The text highlights how the Apostle Paul took this secular, binding, unilateral reality from the Roman streets and co-opted it to explain the mechanics of salvation.
That is brilliant.
Paul's original audience saw this dynamic every morning during the salutatio, when clients would gather at the patron's house to pay their respects. They understood the system intuitively. God the Father is the ultimate patron, giving the unmerited, life-saving gift of charis, and the believer is the client, responding with the lifelong active loyalty of pistis.
The author takes a very firm stance here regarding modern theology based on this historical definition.
Yes, they do not hold back.
The text levels a harsh critique against Arminianism. The author argues that Arminianism fundamentally misunderstands this ancient dynamic, reducing sovereign grace to a tentative offer that sits waiting for a sinner's approval.
Which, in the Roman system, would be absurd.
According to the text, this modern theological framework completely misses the binding unilateral reality of a patron's gift in the ancient world. The author asserts that a patron's gift was not a proposal to be considered. It was a forceful, active reality that established the relationship unilaterally, rescuing the client from a fatal crisis.
That is a stark contrast to how many view it today.
Now, we are strictly framing this as the author's theological stance, but the author's point is fascinating. If you do not understand the mechanics of Roman patronage, you will misunderstand Paul's letters. You will read American democratic ideals of free choice into a Roman system of sovereign patronage.
The author is arguing that we have domesticated the concept of grace because we stripped it of its original sociological weight. We treat grace like a coupon handed to us on the street. We can use it or throw it away.
Yeah, that is a common view.
But in the ancient world, charis from a supreme patron was an event that altered your entire existence and demanded your entire life in response.
If our misunderstanding of structural grammar and ancient sociology causes this much distortion, what happens when we misread ancient imagery?
That opens up a whole new set of problems.
This moves us to the battle between metaphor and proposition. Western readers seem to have an intense demand for concrete data. We are children of the Enlightenment. We want sterile facts, spreadsheets, and bullet points.
Give us the bottom line.
Right. Because of this, we tend to view metaphors as frivolous decoration. We think of poetry as a nice way to dress up the truth, but we assume the real truth is found in a cold, hard proposition.
That is a fundamental difference in epistemology, how we know what we know. The ancient authors did not view language the way a modern scientist does.
How did they view it?
For them, metaphors were not decorations. They were literal, visceral realities intended to evoke deep awe and holistic understanding. They used vivid imagery because it communicated truth more accurately than a sterile proposition ever could.
So a metaphor was actually stronger than a fact.
A proposition appeals only to the intellect. A metaphor appeals to the intellect, the emotions, and the imagination simultaneously.
The text gives a fantastic example of how we constantly try to soften the text to fit our preference for sterile facts. The author brings up Exodus chapter 15, verse 3.
Ah, the Song of Moses.
Yes, in the original Hebrew, after the crossing of the Red Sea, Moses sings a triumphant, terrifying song. He says, "The Lord is a warrior."
A very strong image.
He uses a visceral, aggressive metaphor to strike terror into the hearts of Israel's enemies and to infuse courage into the Israelites. It is a raw, terrifying image of Yahweh acting as a soldier covered in the blood of his enemies. But centuries later, when translators created the Greek Septuagint, they softened it.
They did.
They changed "the Lord is a warrior" to "the Lord shatters wars."
They took a visceral metaphor and flattened it into a sterile proposition. They were uncomfortable with the raw imagery of God as a violent combatant, so they sanitized it for a more philosophically refined Greek audience.
They took the teeth out of it.
They turned a bloody reality into an abstract concept.
The author extends this critique to several contemporary groups regarding the sanitizing effect. The text argues intensely against liberal theology, evangelical critical scholarship, and modern pragmatic seeker-sensitive movements.
A very broad critique.
According to the source, these groups strip the Bible of its historical context and its visceral metaphors for two reasons: either to create therapeutic self-help quotes that offend no one, or to avoid dealing with the supernatural, aggressive realities of the text entirely.
Which is exactly what the Septuagint translators did with Exodus 15.
The author argues that treating the Bible as a collection of motivational slogans or abstract moral principles completely strips the text of its ancient grammatical teeth. It is a striking critique of how modern institutions handle ancient metaphorical language.
The author sees this flattening of metaphors as an act of theological vandalism.
Vandalism, wow.
Yes, because when you remove the visceral imagery, you remove the emotional and spiritual impact the author intended. The danger of flattening metaphors reaches its absolute peak when we look at the Christological climax in John chapter 10.
This is a major point in the text.
The text breaks down the author's most staggering point regarding this. Jesus standing before the crowd and saying, "I am the good shepherd."
To a modern Western reader, this sounds like a quaint pastoral illustration.
A nice, calming picture.
We think of Jesus petting a lamb, holding a staff, giving a moralistic lesson about being kind to animals and looking out for one another. We read it as a sweet, harmless metaphor suitable for a stained glass window. But the original audience did not hear a sweet metaphor, did they?
Not at all. They heard a terrifying claim to absolute deity. To understand what Jesus was doing, the text connects the dots back to Ezekiel chapter 34.
What happens in Ezekiel 34?
In that ancient text, Yahweh looks at the corrupt, wicked leaders of Israel, the false shepherds, and declares that he himself will come down and be the shepherd of his flock.
So God steps in directly.
He promises to rescue his people, judge the wicked shepherds, and establish his reign. So, when Jesus stands in Jerusalem and says, "I am the good shepherd," he is not giving a livestock illustration.
He is quoting Ezekiel.
He was gathering all the canonical weight of the Hebrew scriptures, taking the massive, terrifying metaphor of Yahweh as the shepherd of Israel and applying it directly to himself.
He was claiming the unpronounceable name of Yahweh.
Precisely. The text points out that the original audience understood the grammar and the metaphorical connection perfectly. They possessed the canonical memory to instantly link his words to Ezekiel.
They did not miss a beat.
They knew exactly what he was claiming. That is why they picked up stones to execute him for blasphemy.
Yeah.
They recognized that the metaphor was a claim to absolute divine authority.
And if you read that passage demanding concrete Western propositions and dismissing metaphors as mere poetry, you will completely miss the most massive claim to deity in the entire narrative. You will think they picked up stones because they disliked his agricultural theories.
Which makes no sense historically.
And the source issues an urgent warning regarding how we define words today, connecting this ancient reality to modern sociological frameworks.
Yes, this brings the iceberg concept right into the present day.
The author calls for the explicit rejection of secular philosophy, Marxist dictionaries, critical race theory, and intersectionality as tools for biblical interpretation.
A very strong stance.
The text argues that these modern sociological frameworks are actively redefining biblical terms like justice, oppression, and equity, using secular materialist definitions rather than biblical ones.
Which changes the entire conversation.
The author insists that the justice of God must be defined by his holy character and his law, not by the shifting paradigms of modern sociologists. The author is issuing a stark warning here about the source of our definitions.
The argument is that if you adopt the vocabulary and the definitions of a secular framework, you inevitably adopt the worldview of that framework.
So the dictionary you use matters.
If you define justice using a Marxist dictionary, you will read the biblical commands regarding justice through a Marxist lens, leading to conclusions the biblical authors would never recognize.
If our instincts, our English dictionaries, our preference for concrete data, our sentence structures, and our modern sociological frameworks are constantly leading us astray, how are we supposed to read this text?
It feels overwhelming.
If the iceberg is always there, dragging us off course, does the Bible give us a blueprint for its own interpretation? The source argues yes, and points us to Nehemiah chapter 8 as the ultimate biblical case study for removing these cultural blinders.
Nehemiah chapter 8 is presented by the text as the definitive blueprint for exposition. To understand this blueprint, we have to look at the psychological and historical state of the people.
Paint the picture for us.
The setting is post-exilic Jerusalem. The trauma of the Babylonian exile hangs heavy over the narrative. Their city had been destroyed, their temple burned, and they had spent generations living under a foreign superpower.
A massive cultural disruption.
During that exile, they lost their primary language. They stopped speaking Hebrew and started speaking Aramaic, the language of the empire. Now, by the decree of the Persian king, a remnant has returned. Nehemiah has successfully rebuilt the physical walls of Jerusalem. The city is geographically secure, the gates are hung, and the physical architecture is restored.
I want to look closely at the sequence of events here, because it is fascinating. They waited until the physical walls were completely finished, until the city was impenetrable to foreign armies, before they gathered in the square and asked Ezra to bring the book of the law.
That timing is very deliberate.
Does this sequence suggest that physical security must precede spiritual hunger? Or did the completion of the physical wall expose a massive internal emptiness that bricks and mortar could not fix? They had their city back, they had their walls, but they realized they did not have their identity back. The physical reconstruction actually highlighted their spiritual devastation.
That is a critical observation. The walls provided a boundary, but they did not provide an identity. The people realized that being inside the walls of Jerusalem did not automatically make them the people of God if they did not know the law of God.
So what did they do?
They gather at the water gate. The mechanics of the reading are detailed meticulously in the text. Ezra the scribe stands on a raised wooden platform. He opens the scroll, and he reads the text aloud from early morning until midday.
Just reading for hours.
But the crucial part of the narrative is that he does not just read the text and send them home. The text notes that the Levites moved among the massive crowd to give the sense.
Because the people were hearing ancient Hebrew, but their everyday language was Aramaic.
Correct. The people were experiencing a linguistic gap identical to the one we face today. Many of them could no longer fluently understand the ancient Hebrew of the Torah.
So they needed help.
So the Levites were engaged in live translation and exposition. They were breaking down the idioms, explaining the historical context of laws given centuries prior, and ensuring the people comprehended the meaning. They were melting the iceberg of the Babylonian cultural mindset that had formed over the past 70 years.
The source brings in a reference to the Westminster doctrine of perspicuity here.
A very relevant doctrine.
This doctrine states that the saving message of the Scriptures is clear enough for ordinary believers using ordinary means. The text is not a secret code meant only for an elite priesthood.
Right. Anyone can understand the core message.
But there is a tension here, a paradox that the text unpacks. The text is fundamentally clear regarding salvation, yet the Levites were still required to interpret the idioms, clarify the ranges of meaning, and connect the canonical memory for the people.
The source argues that clarity does not excuse intellectual laziness. The doctrine of perspicuity means the text can be understood, not that it can be understood effortlessly without study.
It still takes work.
You cannot just read an ancient document and expect instantaneous comprehension. The text requires rigorous exposition. It requires teachers, like the Levites, to stand in the gap, understand the original languages, and explain the cultural icebergs to the people.
And when that exposition happens, the result is what the text calls the embodied response.
This is the beautiful part of the narrative.
The text describes the communal nature of the scene in vivid detail. Men, women, and all who could understand were gathered. When Ezra opened the book, the entire crowd stood up. It was a physical act of reverence.
A physical reaction to the reading.
They lifted their hands, they wept as the Levites explained the text, and they realized how far their lives had fallen from the covenant requirements. They bowed their faces to the ground, and they answered, Amen, Amen.
It was a completely holistic reaction. It engaged their minds through the exposition, their emotions through their weeping, and their bodies through standing and bowing.
Not just an intellectual exercise.
Not at all. It was not a private mystical impression received alone in a quiet room. It was not an ecclesiastical mediation keeping the text locked away from the public. It was a massive communal submission to a reality they had finally grasped because the text had been properly explained to them.
The linguistic gap had been bridged.
The linguistic gap had been bridged, and the result was repentance and worship.
So how do we translate the Nehemiah 8 model into practical steps for your daily life? How do you apply this? The sources give us clear directives.
Which is very helpful for the listener.
First, compare formal and dynamic translations. Do not rely on just one English version. Look at a formal, word-for-word translation to see the raw structure, and then look at a dynamic, thought-for-thought translation to see how the translators handled the idioms.
That is a great first step.
Second, identify the genre. You cannot read the apocalyptic visions of Revelation like you are reading a morning newspaper. You cannot read the Psalms like you are reading a biology textbook. The genre dictates the rules of engagement.
Context is everything.
Finally, demand rigorous exegesis from your teachers. The author insists on understanding the syntax trees, the Hebrew clause structures, and the ancient extra-biblical usage.
That sounds academic, but it is vital.
And when the author mentions demanding teachers understand syntax trees, they aren't trying to sound elite. They are just talking about the fundamental structure of how sentences are built, how clauses connect to each other to form a logical argument, rather than just pulling isolated words out of context.
Right. It is about respecting the grammar.
Do not settle for motivational speeches with a few verses sprinkled on top. Require your teachers to act like the Levites, breaking down the ancient texts so you can truly understand the meaning.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Building on everything we have discussed, we've spent this entire time talking about the invisible iceberg of the modern, Western, post-Enlightenment mindset.
The massive ice block below the surface.
We have shown how our individualism, our demand for propositions, and our English vocabulary distort the ancient text. But consider this. If our current cultural mindset acts as an invisible iceberg for us today, what will the iceberg look like for the next generation?
Oh, that is a wild thought.
The written word of the ancient text remains static. It never changes. But cultural icebergs are always melting, shifting, and freezing into completely new shapes. As technology alters our attention spans, as society changes how it defines relationships, new blinders are formed.
So the problem will keep evolving.
Will the readers of the 22nd century have to strip away our 21st century interpretations to finally see the text clearly? What new biases are forming right now that will obscure the truth tomorrow?
That is a staggering thought. The work of interpretation is never truly finished because the culture is always shifting beneath our feet, creating new obstacles to comprehension.
We always have to be vigilant.
I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden layers of language and translation. We hope this has challenged you to look at the text with fresh eyes, a rigorous mind, and a new awareness of the ice hiding below the surface. Until next time, keep reading, keep questioning, and keep digging beneath the surface.